So I'm just seeing, and I really believe in both cases, and I'll get to the other one in just a second here. We have two major pieces of legislation going through the House and Senate right now. This is a time to be paying attention. One of them is the reauthorization of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, or a variation on it, the USA Freedom Act, right? You put, oh, freedom. No, it's the USA Spying Act on its own citizens, which basically says, yeah, the government can continue to spy on you. It just has to ask the phone companies for their records. And, of course, the phone companies are going to say, well, yeah, but you're going to have to pay us. So really the USA Freedom Act is just privatizing the spying and, you know, probably a financial boon of significant consequence to the phone companies. So we have these, you know, I identified these three dimensions of this thing. Number one, you know, bureaucracies, whether they're government or corporate, it pretty much doesn't matter. Organizations always try to grow. I mean, the leaders want more power. They want bigger budgets. It's human nature. So to some extent, this explosion in the internal security state, the spying against Americans, which is nothing new, by the way. I mean, look at what J. Edgar Hoover was doing with Martin Luther King, among others. I mean, you know, I was spied on when I was in SDS back in the 60s. And obviously not just me. I mean, you know, it's just pretty much everybody. Although you could argue that, you know, particularly once the Weather Underground got going, that there was maybe some legitimate reason for them to be keeping track of us anyway. Although I was never involved in anything that would threaten any human being or property, and did not agree with the Weather Underground people. Just like I don't agree with the Black Bloc people from Occupy, you know, the trash the buildings people. But still, you know, I get that. So it's not, you know, a national security state. You have to have national security. But do we spy on everybody all the time? So number one, you've got bureaucracies wanting to grow. The FBI wants to get bigger. The NSA wants to get bigger. They're building a huge complex out in Utah, blah, 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 blah. Number two, you've got politicians, basically, who are trying to make hay with this. Rand Paul is betting his entire run for the presidency on this thing, and he's raising money on it. And I'm not criticizing him for it, because I think that he's right on the issue. And, you know, I mentioned yesterday the Politico piece over the weekend talking about how Rand Paul may not actually be a viable candidate for president of the United States as a Republican because he doesn't have a pet billionaire. Or so far, he has not been able to acquire a billionaire who will support him. Now, whether he's hoping that, you know, opposing the USA Freedom Act and as well as the Patriot Act, whether he's hoping that will get him a billionaire, I mean, it might. Or whether he's hoping that will create a grassroots movement so that it can be kind of Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders, who are the guys who are funded by the we the people. You know, who knows? Or both. I mean, maybe he's doing both strategies. So anyhow, that's number two, is you've got politicians, but my concern is not the Rand Paul politicians and the Bernie Sanders politicians who are saying no to this. My concern is the politicians who are going, be afraid, be very afraid, look out. Hey, anthrax, look out. Ah! When I was a kid, and back in the old days, I remember well, back in 1955 or thereabouts, being in first grade. Well, it would have been 57, I think, in first grade, but whatever. When I was 6, 7 years old, I remember being in elementary school, and suddenly the sirens would go off, and we would have to jump underneath our chairs or underneath our desks. And there was a very specific technique that we learned where you put your hands over your eyes and you put your thumbs over the little flap over your ears and push your ears closed so that when the nuclear blast goes off, it won't blind you and deafen you. Now, it'll cook you and kill you with radiation, but it won't blind you or deafen you. It was called Duck and Cover. There were these nice little commercials, Duck and Cover, you know, all that kind of stuff. So my generation grew up being afraid that the Soviet Union was going to nuke us. And that was enormously profitable for the business, for the companies the defense contractors who built the nuclear bombs and who built all the stuff having to do with the Soviet Union and fighting the Soviet Union. But privatization hadn't yet gone on steroids. And 1976 had not yet happened when the Supreme Court ruled that you could buy politicians, that the First Amendment allowed people, billionaires, to buy politicians. And then a year later in the Boston versus Bilotti decision, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations could also buy politicians. So back then it was more like, just the military was getting bigger. Now the defense contractors were making a fortune on this thing too. Now, this generation, right, the kids who are growing up now, they're not duck and covering about nukes coming from the Soviet Union. They're duck and covering about, what happens when somebody from Al-Qaeda comes in and shoots up their classroom. Or, or some idiot who's been watching too many NRA TV shows and is convinced that, the guy, whatever, the like Adam Lanza's mother, these freepers, they're not freepers. What is the word for the preppers? Getting ready, preparing for the end of the world. With their AR-15s and their rifles and their guns and their, everything else. So you've got the politicians who are pandering to them. Then you've got this industry that's making a fortune. And this is what Henry Wallace was talking about when he warned us about fascism. He said they want to capture political power so that using the power of the state and the power of the marketplace simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. And I would add, they can extract money from the state and move it into private industry, which is what they're doing. I mean, Ed Snowden was working for a private company. He wasn't working for the NSA or the CIA. He was working for Booz Allen Hamilton, a private defense contractor, one of many. What do we do about this? I think we amend the Constitution.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
So amend the Constitution to say that money is not speech and corporations are not people, number one. And number two, let's wake up and become sane again.